If you follow the news, especially financial or political news, you've definitely heard this term carried interest. It's one of those phrases that just gets people fired up, right? It always seems to pit Wall Street against, well, everyone else. So what is it really? Let's break it all down. The whole controversy really boils down to one single question. How is it possible that some of the wealthiest people in the entire country, we're talking about managers of huge private equity and venture capital funds, end up paying a lower tax rate on their earnings than a lot of teachers, firefighters, or nurses? The answer, as you can imagine, is complicated, and it all revolves around how carried interest is taxed. And this, right here, this is it. This is the heart of the entire debate. See, for most of us, our salaries and bonuses are taxed as ordinary income. The top federal rate for that is 37%. But carried interest, which is the main way these top fund managers get paid, is usually taxed at the much, much lower long-term capital gains rate. That's just 20%. That's 17-point gap. Well, that's where our story really gets interesting. Okay, so before we can really get into the tax fight, we have to understand what carried interest even is. And you might be surprised to learn the idea isn't new at all. In fact, its roots go way, way back. I want you to picture a sea captain back in the 16th century. You've got investors who pay for the ship and all the cargo. Now, if the captain manages to sail across treacherous seas and sell all those goods for a profit, he gets to keep a piece of it, usually about 20%, for carrying the cargo safely. It was a reward for his skill, for his risk, and for a successful trip. And believe it or not, that's the basic model from modern finance. So, fast forward to today. Carried interest, or just carry as they call it, is that performance fee that goes to the fund managers. They're known as the general partners, or GPs. It's their slice of the pie, that classic 20%. But here's the absolutely crucial part. It's compensation for their performance. This is not a return on their own money they've invested. It's a fee for making the investors' money grow. This is all part of the famous 2 and 20 model. So the managers get a 2% management fee every year, and that's based on how much money is in the fund. That part, the 2, is taxed just like a regular salary as ordinary income. But the 20, that's the 20% share of the profits, the carried interest. And that's the part that gets that special lower tax rate we've been talking about. So, how does a fund actually make all this money and then pay out the carry? Well, it's a pretty long process, a whole life cycle that can take years and years to play out. So it all starts with the general partners raising a ton of cash from investors, who are called limited partners, or LPs. Think big pension funds, university endowments. You get the idea. The GPs then take that money and invest it in companies. They work to grow those companies over several years, and then eventually they sell them, hopefully for a huge profit. And it's only then, at the very end, that the profits get handed out. Now, here's a really important check on the system. The fund managers don't just get their 20% cut of any old profit. Oh no. First, the investors, the LPs, have to get every single penny of their original investment back. And on top of that, there's usually something called a hurdle rate, which is a minimum return, say 8% a year, that the investors have to get before the managers see a dime of their carry. It's a huge protection for the people who put up the cash. And the way that cash flows back is called a waterfall, and it's actually pretty complex. In the American model, managers can start collecting their carry after each individual successful deal, so they get paid sooner, which is great for them. But there's a catch. If later deals in the same fund end up losing money, they might have to pay some of that carry back. That's called a clawback. Now, the European model is different. It's seen as much more investor-friendly. The managers only get their carry after the entire fund has returned all the investors' capital plus that hurdle rate. All right, so now we know what carry is and how it works. Let's get to the billion-dollar question. Why is the way it's taxed so incredibly controversial? The whole debate really comes down to 2 completely different ways of looking at what carried interest is. On one side, you have supporters who say it's a reward for taking huge risks. They call it sweat equity. They argue that the lower tax rate encourages managers to make smart, long-term investments that help the whole economy grow. But on the other side, you have critics who say, hold on a minute, carry is just payment for a service, managing money. They believe it's no different from a performance bonus and should be taxed just like a regular salary, especially since it's not a return on the manager's own invested cash. So what's actually at stake here, financially? Well, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, if you were to tax carried interest like regular income, it would bring in about $13 billion in new tax revenue over 10 years. But as you can imagine, the industry itself sees that number very differently. The American Investment Council, which is a big private equity lobby group, famously quipped that the annual revenue gain from this change would be, quote, not enough money to build a road from Austin to Dallas. Their point is that, in the grand scheme of the federal budget, it's not a huge amount of money, and changing the rule could scare off investment for what they see as a pretty small gain. You know, this is not some new fight that just popped up. This battle over carried interest has been a major political hot potato in Washington for almost 20 years now. Lawmakers have tried to change this rule over and over again. The first big push was way back in 2007. Then a decade later, in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made a tweak. It said you had to hold an investment for 3 years instead of just one to get the lower tax rate. But the fight just keeps going. As recently as 2022, a plan to finally tax carry as ordinary income was included in the Inflation Reduction Act, and then it got stripped out at the very last minute. It just goes to show you how powerful and politically protected this tax treatment really is. And here's the real kicker about that 2017 reform, the one that moved the goalpost from 1 year to 3. It barely made a dent. Why? Because most private equity funds, the main group this targets, already hold their investments for 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer. So for them, a 3-year minimum didn't change a thing about how they do business or how much they pay in taxes. And that brings us right back to where we started. This whole debate over carried interest, it's about more than just tax policy. It's really about what we as a society decide is valuable and worth rewarding. Is it a fair and necessary incentive for the risk takers who build our economy? Or is it an unfair tax loophole that lets a very small, very wealthy group play by a different set of rules? Ultimately, the answer really depends on how you see it, as economic fuel or as a fundamental flaw in the tax code. And for now, that question continues to be one of Washington's biggest unresolved fights.